And now we are going to be talking about the Jacksonville Jaguars as we come over here. So let's start with these losses for those Jags, starting with wide receiver Calvin Ridley, who we just talked about, went to the Titans there. Zay Jones is gone and went to Arizona. Foley Fatukasi, I apologize, Foley, definitely fucked that up. He is on the Texans. Look at all these interdivision, just
I know,
staying in the South,
to rivals.
And then cornerback Trey Herndon went to my New York Football Giants. On the additions, brought in a good amount of guys. Quarterback McCorkle Jones, wide receiver Gabe Davis coming over from Buffalo. Ezra Cleveland, who they picked up mid-season from Minnesota, who was a good pickup. Center Mitch Morse from the Buffalo Bills. Defensive lineman Arik Armstead. Cornerback Ronald Darby. Safety Darnell Savage. And wide receiver Brian Thomas. A lot of guys that have starting experience. Some veterans that they picked up. They really went with experience over youth here, did Jacksonville. How do you think that's going to play out for them? What are your big takeaways for this Jacksonville Jaguars team?
Yeah, no, I think, for the most part, they're basically running it back with a couple of additions. I mean, yes, they've changed out their wide receiver core, but other than that, they really haven't changed, or they really didn't lose much. And when it comes to the wide receiver core, like obviously Calvin Ridley, like we just talked about, he's a really good player, but you bring in a star rookie in Brian Thomas Jr. I know you're not as high on him as I am. But you bring in a guy with some deep threat speed in Brian Thomas that was definitely missing last year. You also bring in a guy in Gabe Davis who, had his ups and downs in Buffalo, but he definitely showed some spark for at times as well. And then, I think for the Jacksonville Jaguars, it's just all about getting healthy. They started the season red hot. And then towards the end of the season, I think they would finish like 1-5 or something like that.
You're damn right they did.
Exactly. Part of that being, quarterback T-Law, Sunshine, whatever.
We refer to him as Goldilocks around here.
Yeah. Goldilocks. Trevor Lawrence, had like 3 injuries that would normally knock dudes out for multiple weeks in terms of a high ankle sprain, a concussion.
Remember when he had a concussion and turned around and played in like 4 days?
Yeah. He had, I think,
so much for the concussion protocol.
I think he had a high ankle sprain. Next week he ended up getting a concussion, and next week he ended up getting like an AC sprain, something like that. So he was banged up through that last month of the season.
Yeah.
And then obviously you lose Christian Kirk midway through the season. He never ended up returning. So I think it really comes down to just getting dudes healthy again. But I do like the additions of those veteran defensive guys and a couple additions on offense, on that offensive line as well, just to protect Trevor Lawrence so he's not getting beat to a pulp running for his life.
Yeah, I have a feeling we're going to be on opposite sides of this team as well. The Jaguars definitely absolutely plummeted at the end of the season and helped me cash a nice Texans AFC South champion at plus 450. So thank you for that, Jacksonville. All right, let's talk about some of these injuries. Really quickly, I will mention Jamal Agnew, who is no longer with the team, but he is a free agent. He had that nasty lower leg fracture. 3 to 4 month expected recovery timeline. He's got about 8 months. He should be good to go for the season, assuming somebody picks him up. So he's still a free agent. Just wanted to mention him there. Other guy we're going to spend a little more time with, Christian Kirk. Derek just talked about him. Had a core muscle surgery, early December, late in the season, I should say. 2 to 3 months expected recovery timeline. He was close to returning, just didn't really get to that point. He's got 9 months till the actual start of week 1, assuming, he was close to returning last year. Are you got any concerns with Kirk going into this year?
Nope, not at all.
Yep. Okay, good. Glad we're on the same page there. Some guys we may have a little bit more concern with, some of these new folks that we brought in. Gabe Davis, coming in from Buffalo, PCL strain, did not play in the playoffs due to this PCL strain. PCL, your posterior collateral ligament, one of the major stabilizing ligaments in the knee. On the backside, posterior, right? Obviously prevents that tibia from shooting backwards. there. So anyway, really my question here for you is typically they called it a grade true. There was no surgery as we know, or as long as what's been reported. He did not have surgery, so we're going to call it a grade 2 PCL strain. 2 to 3 months, at worst case, typically. Now, he's not returned to being full health or full go. He still was limited in OTAs in May. I was just a little surprised by this. Are you concerned, or you think they're just being cautious with him?
I'm hoping they're just being cautious with him, to be honest. I think it's kind of a funky thing, especially with him, kind of transitioning down to Jacksonville. I would almost lean towards them being a little bit more cautious with him.
Yeah, paid him a lot of money. Don't want to
exactly.
crazy. Okay,
right. But it is kind of hard to say. I think it's one of those things. Again, we just got to see how active he is that first week of training camp to really judge, what kind of shape Gabe Davis is in.
Yeah, training camp is going to definitely clear up a lot of things for a lot of guys that we're going to have some guys we're just going to be watching closely, right? And I think Gabe Davis falls into this because, we are at month 5 or 6 now. I would expect him to be close to full health. So really, that's the thing is are they limiting him because Jacksonville doesn't want to, risk someone they just paid a lot of money? Or is he truly behind the 8 ball right now? So that's where I have a little pause with Gabe Davis. And then Arik Armstead coming over from San Francisco had a bit of an interesting journey here. Last year in week 13, he injured his knee. He tore his meniscus. He sat out 5 games, the last 5 games of the season, in order to work his way back for the playoffs. He played with the torn meniscus for those 3 games of the playoffs, including the Super Bowl where he did get a sack. So really just gutted through that, was an absolute warrior, and he had to have surgery after the season. Now, he did elect for a meniscus repair as opposed to a meniscectomy or a meniscus removal, where meniscus removal, they simply remove it, but you don't get it back. So worse long-term, but shorter recovery. Meniscus repair, better long-term for the knee, more longer recovery. Let's talk about that. He's got 6.5 months from around the surgery gate to the start of the season. What are you thinking?
Yeah, no, like you said, I think the biggest difference between really with his injury is what kind of surgery he gets. I think it's probably best for his long-term quality of life health to go ahead and get that meniscus repair, like you kind of mentioned there before, especially with, again, we're talking about it like a 6'7", 6'8", 300-pound dude. Arik Armstead is a massive defensive lineman, right? And if we don't have that meniscus, if they just go in and cut it out and do a meniscectomy, yes, he's back in a month. But at the same time, like, now is he beating up his cartilage? Now is he having degenerative, osteoarthritis issues? With that meniscus repair, we don't have nearly as much concern with those things. So he probably did the right thing as far as his timeline goes. 4 to 6 months, he should be fine come week 1. Especially because I will say in Jacksonville, the part of their defense that I think is probably the weakest is probably that front 4. I think in general, they're kind of rolling the dice with a couple of guys up front. So of course they have Josh Allen still there, but other than him, they need a couple other dudes, and Arik Armstead's going to be that guy. But, will they put him on, a little bit of restricted timeline those first week or 2? Will he play much through the preseason? Time will tell.
Yeah. No, and then that kind of leads me into my point with my concerns here for this Jacksonville Jaguars defense. You kind of hit on it, right? You got Armstead cutting it pretty close to we'll see if he's out there for training camp. I think he's going to start at least limited, and we'll see if he can progress and have – I doubt he has any snaps in preseason, but let's see. With him – dealing with that injury, that's going to take him right up to the week 1. And like you mentioned, their starting defensive tackles are Devon Hamilton, Roy Robertson Harris. And then if Armstead can't play, you slide in Adam Gotsis. Not exactly what is striking fear into my heart as an offensive coordinator. Josh Allen is a good player, but one man cannot create an entire D-line. And really their secondary.
Yeah. Part of that, they did get Mason Smith out of LSU in the 2nd round this year, so he might be able to slide in there.
He's a good player.
So I think he could slide in there in place of Arik Armstead, but at the same time, like you said, some of those other guys, have basically been career backups,
Yep.
rotational guys. So
Just names on a paper right now. And then the
exactly.
secondary, I also have some concerns with. You've got, I do think Tyson Campbell is a good young player, but
Mhm.
guys like Ronald Darby, Darnell Savage, Antonio Johnson, not really, especially Darby and Savage, some journeyman type guys. Andre Cisco, a young player who's shown some promise. But this secondary and this front four leave me a lot of questions. I do think their linebackers are solid in Devin Lloyd, Alua and Walker, which if you
Mhm.
play IDP fantasy, you definitely got to know Alua absolute tackling machine. We'll be on
Yep.
some of his tackle props this season. I can guarantee you that. That's where some concerns come in for me. And we'll talk fantasy real quick, and then I'll get into my best bets here.
Sure.
From the fantasy perspective, really, it kind of goes into something we're actually going to talk about. But I'm not high on this team. I'll talk about it in a second. But Evan Ingram, as much as it pains me to say as a Giants fan, because my guy went from Butterfingers to Pokemon, we got to catch them all apparently in Jacksonville. But he's going to be a reception machine this year. I mean, you take away, some of those wide receivers. You've got Gabe Davis, Brian Thomas. Those are going to be some of your bigger player receivers, right? Some of your deep threats. We talked about Christian Kirk can be a viable, reliable receiver, but I think Evan Ingram is going to definitely be that safety belt. I mean, he was the second leading receiver on the team last year. Calvin Ridley, their leading receiver, obviously is in Tennessee. So he does have the most yards and that connection with T-Law, Goldilocks there. So I just think Evan Ingram, I think that he's a great value, at where he's going right now. Cause I think he's got the potential to have like a top 3 tight end year in fantasy. Any major fantasy takeaways for the Jags for your side?
Nothing major. No, I think everybody is kind of high on um, or is higher on Christian Kirk this year
Yeah.
with his return. I think probably likely or rightly so. Gabe Davis, I'm not as high on as many would be, just because of some of our concerns that we talked about already. Plus, he's one of those boom or bust kind of wide receivers. He's kind of proven that. So even with the change in offense, change in quarterback, I just don't see him having a huge year. But
Yeah, no, I would agree. And we're going to talk about it right now. So Jacksonville Jaguars 9-8 last year with a win total of 8.5 minus 110 each way. So my first bet for this Jacksonville Jaguars team is under 6.5 wins at plus 260. Yes, I said 6.5. I think they're a 6 or a 5 win team. Now, let's get into this. So we talked about the concerns on the defensive line and the secondary. Right now, yes, their linebacker core is good. They have Josh Allen, but they just have a lot of names on paper for me. This is a defense that is very unproven, a lot of journeymen on this defense. And then the offensive side of the ball. I am not somebody in the camp who thinks Trevor Lawrence and Goldilocks is worth all this money. I think he still has all this potential. I think he's had plenty of time to prove it. What has he actually done other than make Chargers fans eternally sad with that massive comeback in the playoffs? I do not think this team is better than last year. I think they lost their best receiver in Calvin Ridley. I am not high on Gabe Davis. I'm not high on Brian Thomas. I think those are big boomer bust guys. Yes, I think Evan Ingram can get his, but this offensive line is also aging. You have guys like Mitch Morse, Brandon Scherf, Ezra Cleveland, all guys who have been around for a long time, even Cam Robinson. So I think there's a lot of concerns for this Jacksonville Jaguars team. And a lot of people are just writing them in to kind of be right in that playoff mix. And I do not see it with this Jags team at all this year. So give me the under 6.5 at plus 260. The other thing I'm going to take another under for them is Brian Thomas under 4.5 touchdowns at plus 100. How many Jacksonville Jaguars players had more than 4.5 receiving touchdowns last year? How many Jacksonville Jaguars players on the team currently have more than 4.5 touchdowns last year? That would be 0. Calvin Ridley, only player. So I do not think this is something that happens very often. I don't think a rookie's going to come in here and be able to do this. I think Evan Ingram and Christian Kirk may pop over this number, but I've talked about it. I'm not very high on Trevor Lawrence, and I'm not very high on Brian Thomas. I think he's a guy who very greatly benefited from playing with the Heisman Trophy winner in Jaden Daniels and what I think is going to be the best rookie receiver in the league in Malik Neighbors. Maybe a little bit of Giants bias, but give me Brian Thomas under 4.5 touchdowns at plus 100. That's receiving touchdowns. All right, what do you got?
So again, we are conflicting on some of our best bets directly, basically, because I'm taking Brian Thomas's over touchdowns, over 4.5 touchdowns, because his piece of their offense was completely missing last year. They had no deep threat. That he is their deep threat. I would not be surprised if he has probably 3 or 4 touchdowns over 20, 30 yards. He is that dude that gets downfield and makes a play. And they didn't have one of those last year. We also kind of forget that, again, Trevor Lawrence was not healthy the last third of the season last year. So some of those guys that may have had some more production just didn't, because Trevor Lawrence was beaten and battered through the last third of the year. So I really do think Brian Thomas is going to take that step deep and be their big deep threat receiver. And you mentioned, with him and Gabe Davis kind of being boom or busts, yeah, that's what I'm counting on for him to get in the end zone, is him to catch 2 balls and have 75 yards.
Okay.
And a touchdown. And, and is it going to be consistent? Probably not. But I think he does fill a void with this Jags offense. So I do expect some bigger things than you do, obviously, from Brian Thomas Jr. And I also think the Jags do sneak into the playoffs this year. So I'm going to say that they make the playoffs at plus 130 because, again, they started off the season winning games. Trevor Lawrence wins games. And he's proven that over the majority of his football career. But
maybe in high school and college, but all right.
But anyways, they were in playoff contention up until the last game. And yes, they finished 1-5 or whatever they did. But we've already talked about the guy, Trevor Lawrence, in his injury history, basically the entire year, but especially that last third of the season where they really took a dive. So I do think that, they've made some additions on their offensive line. Yes, they are getting a little bit older, but until further, notice, I think that should be improved. And you still have ETN coming out of the backfield, who's a solid player. So I do think that the Jags do win an extra game. Maybe they get to 10-7 and sneak into the playoffs as a wild card.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we might have to take this one off the books and get a little bit of a side wagers going on some of these we disagree on. But all right. So, Derek is definitely more optimistic, but I think we can agree that Brian Thomas is probably a guy that if you do like, probably a better underdog best ball kind of setup than, managed league with that boomer bust potential.